I was in the middle of closing out another late shift when Caleb called, asking if I could meet him at our parents' house. He sounded upbeat and excitable, like he did every time he had some big news to share. I knew the drill. Caleb had an idea, a business opportunity that he wanted everyone to be as thrilled about as he was. I sighed, exhausted but curious enough to go along with it. That's the way things always went with Caleb. He was the golden child, and every new venture he threw himself into felt like a family event. When I arrived, the living room was packed with excitement, my parents beaming at Caleb like he'd already struck gold. He was talking about his grand plan, describing a trendy new restaurant he wanted to open downtown. The place would have an organic, farm to table concept, something he claimed was going to totally change the game. I could see his enthusiasm, but beneath it was the same reckless spark I'd seen so many times before. Caleb's eyes gleamed with confidence, and he glanced over at me with that familiar look, as if expecting my approval to validate his idea. I forced a smile, letting him finish his pitch. But inside, a quiet alarm was ringing. Caleb had tried his hand at a half dozen things before this: drop shipping, a travel blog, selling luxury candles. Each one ended with him losing interest or spending way more than he ever made. But our parents had supported him each time, always seeing these failures as learning experiences. After Caleb wrapped up his presentation, Dad looked at me with an almost expectant expression. "Isn't this incredible, Amelia? Your brother's really onto something this time." I wanted to tell them the truth, that maybe Caleb needed to think this through more carefully, that restaurants are notoriously tough to make profitable. But I couldn't bring myself to ruin their moment. Instead, I swallowed my reservations. "It sounds like a big undertaking," I said slowly, choosing my words with care. "Have you thought about what it'll cost to get started?" Caleb waved my question away, smiling with that easy confidence of his. "That's the thing. I've got it mostly figured out. I just need a little help from the family, to get it off the ground." And there it was. He needed money, and I could already see the expectation in my parents' eyes. We all knew Caleb wasn't financially sound, and they were looking at me, the reliable one, to help fill the gap. It wasn't the first time. The difference was that this time, I had my own dreams on the line. I'd been saving every penny to go back to school, to finally get the business degree I'd put off for years. I'd worked long hours, taken on extra shifts, and scraped together every bit of my pay to make it happen. The thought of parting with that money sent a cold wave of dread through me. Mom leaned forward, her expression soft but firm. "Amelia, honey, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could support your brother in this? It's just a bit of money, and it could really help him get a fresh start." I swallowed hard, feeling a knot form in my chest. "I've been saving up for school, Mom. I can't just give that up." Dad chuckled, patting my hand in that patronizing way he thought was reassuring. "Oh, Amelia, you're young. School will always be there. But Caleb has this chance now. Family sticks together." I took a breath, studying myself. "I get that, Dad, but my plans matter too. I've worked hard for this." I looked over at Caleb, hoping he'd understand, maybe even back me up for once. But he just stared at me with a frown, like I was betraying him by even hesitating. Dad's face tightened and he sighed. "Amelia, we know how much you've sacrificed, but think about how much this would mean to your brother. Isn't that what family is for?" I felt cornered. It was like my words were bouncing off walls of determination. No matter how I tried to explain, I could see their minds were set. To them, my ambitions weren't as important as Caleb's dreams, which, despite their constant failure, always seemed to take center stage. Finally, out of some misguided hope that this would somehow make things better, I agreed to lend a small amount. I rationalized that maybe this would be enough to show my support without sacrificing everything. "All right, I can lend a little," I said, forcing a tight smile. "But I need to keep most of my savings intact for my tuition. I can't go beyond that." Mom and Dad exchanged a look, and Caleb's expression turned smug, like he'd already won some silent argument. They seemed pleased enough with my concession, and I left that night with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't right, But I had no idea how deep the betrayal would go. A few months passed, and Caleb's restaurant opened with all the fanfare he'd promised. He invited the entire family to the opening night, and the place was packed. He had designed the place to look upscale and trendy, with dim lighting and rustic decor. On the surface, it looked like he'd finally managed to pull something off. But as I watched him that night, mingling with guests and soaking up the praise, I noticed the cracks in the facade. He seemed more focused on image than on substance, and a few quiet complaints from the kitchen staff about supplies running low didn't go unnoticed. The initial excitement died down, and the realities of running a business began to hit. Caleb started calling more often, always with stories about unexpected expenses or rude customers who didn't understand his vision. He'd vent, frustrated and impatient, and my parents would listen sympathetically, always finding someone else to blame. They never once questioned his decisions, even as the costs piled up. Then came the day when everything unraveled. I'd stopped by my bank on a whim to check my savings account, wanting to know exactly how much I had left before applying for a small loan for tuition. But when the banker printed out my balance, I felt my stomach drop. My entire savings, every penny I'd set aside over years of hard work, was gone. Numb with shock, I stumbled out of the bank and drove straight to my parents' house. I didn't even bother calling ahead. When I walked in, I found them in the living room, looking far too relaxed. They looked up, surprised to see me. "Where is it?" I asked, voice trembling. "Where is my money?" Mom's face fell, and she exchanged a quick, guilty look with Dad. "Amelia, please sit down. Let's talk about this calmly," she said, in that gentle tone she always used to defuse tension. "No, I want to know where my money went. Did you take it for Caleb?" Dad cleared his throat, trying to look authoritative, but faltering under my glare. "Yes, we used it to help Caleb," he admitted. "We thought you'd understand. It was necessary for his business, Amelia. This is a family matter." "A family matter?" My voice rose. "That was my life savings. I told you I needed that for school. You had no right." Mom put a hand on my arm, as if to pacify me. "Sweetheart, we know you've been patient and understanding. You're so responsible. We knew you'd handle it better than Caleb ever could. He needed this chance, Amelia." I felt a mixture of anger and betrayal rising inside me, sharp and relentless. "You gave him my money without even asking me?" Dad shook his head, frustrated. "Amelia, you're making this all about yourself. Family is about sacrifices. You'll have plenty of opportunities, but Caleb," I cut him off, unable to hear another word. "No, no, I've sacrificed enough. I'm done being the one who always gives." With that, I turned on my heel, ignoring my parents' shop stares and their feeble protests. I needed to get out of there before I said something that couldn't be taken back. But as I walked away, I knew something fundamental had shattered inside me. My trust, my sense of belonging, it was all gone. I felt like a stranger in my own family. As I left, I knew that things could never go back to the way they were. And maybe for the first time in my life, I was okay with that. In the weeks that followed, a silence settled between my family and me. I stopped answering Caleb's calls, letting them go to voicemail, where he'd leave rambling messages asking for support, forgiveness, or just someone to listen. My parents, predictably, were upset by my sudden withdrawal, calling me stubborn and selfish in text messages that I couldn't bring myself to respond to. I couldn't explain to them how deeply they'd wounded me, how the betrayal had cut through every single layer of trust I'd once placed in them. In my mind, I kept replaying those moments at the bank, the shock of seeing my balance at zero, and the look on my parents' faces when I confronted them. They hadn't even tried to apologize. Instead, they'd spun it as if I was the unreasonable one, as if my life's plans and dreams could be casually sacrificed for Caleb's next failure. I poured my frustration into work, taking on even more hours. My job became a strange comfort, a place where I didn't have to question anyone's loyalty or intentions. The late hours numbed my thoughts, leaving me too exhausted to dwell on what my family had done. Still, every time I clocked in, I couldn't ignore the sting of starting over from scratch. One night, as I was wiping down tables and thinking about the tuition I could have paid by now, my manager approached, handing me an envelope. Hey, Amelia, you're putting in a lot of hours here. Thought you might want to see this. Inside was an offer for a promotion, a step up to assistant manager with a small pay increase. It wasn't enough to replace what I'd lost, but it was a step forward, a reminder that, despite everything, I was moving ahead. I felt a glimmer of pride, the first positive emotion I'd felt in weeks. Accepting the offer felt like claiming a piece of independence, a promise to myself that I could rise above the chaos my family had pulled me into. That weekend, I decided I needed to clear my head and went for a hike alone. At the summit, as I looked out over the valley, the air felt thinner, lighter, like the weight of my family's demands had lifted just a little. Up there, away from everyone, I thought about what life would be like without constantly running to Caleb's rescue. I imagined a future where my plans came first, where I could pursue my dreams without guilt or resentment weighing me down. The peace didn't last long. The next morning, a text from Caleb shattered my brief moment of calm. We need to talk. It's about the restaurant. Please, Amelia, just hear me out. I didn't want to respond. I knew how these conversations went. He tried to tug at whatever remained of my loyalty until I agreed to help him again. But part of me was curious. Part of me wondered if he'd finally realized the harm he'd done, if there was some shred of accountability hidden beneath his excuses. I met him at a small cafe, keeping my guard up as I took a seat across from him. Caleb looked more worn out than usual. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands fidgeted with the coffee cup in front of him. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy, but I quickly squashed it. I couldn't afford to feel sorry for him. Not this time. Amelia, he began, avoiding my gaze, I know things have been rough between us lately. I get why you're upset. Do you? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Do you actually understand what you've done? Or is this just another attempt to get me to feel sorry for you? He flinched but didn't argue. Look, I know I messed up, okay? The restaurant's struggling more than I thought it would. The overhead is killing me, and the staff keep quitting. I didn't realize how tough it would be. Didn't realize, I echoed bitterly. And yet you took everything I had for your dream. You didn't even ask, Caleb. He rubbed his temples, his face tightening with frustration. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Mom and Dad had faith in me. They believed in this. But it's just not going as planned. I'm in way over my head, and I don't know what to do anymore. He looked at me then, a flicker of desperation in his eyes, and I knew what was coming. I need your help, he said quietly. Just one last time. If I could just get a little more support, I could turn this around. Please, Amelia, I'm begging you. It was like he hadn't heard a single word I'd said, like all the hurt and betrayal didn't matter. I felt something inside me snap. This wasn't just a plea for help. This was manipulation, a trap disguised as family loyalty. All my life, I'd been the responsible one, the safety net, the one who put everyone else first. And here he was asking for more, expecting that same sacrifice again. No, I said, my voice steady. I've done enough for you, Caleb. I've sacrificed more than you'll ever know, and all you've done is take. I'm not giving you another cent. The shock on his face was almost satisfying. For the first time, I could see that he hadn't anticipated this, hadn't expected me to actually stand my ground. He sputtered, trying to find the right words, but I didn't wait for him to recover. You need to figure this out on your own, I said, standing up to leave. Maybe it's time you felt the consequences for once. As I walked out, I felt an odd sense of relief, mixed with a sadness that lingered under the surface. The reality of our fractured relationship settled heavily over me, but it was also freeing. I'd finally said no, finally chosen my own needs over his endless demands. But Caleb wasn't done. In the days that followed, I began to notice whispers around town, strange looks from people who usually greeted me with warm smiles. It wasn't long before I discovered why. Caleb had been telling anyone who'd listened that I'd abandoned him, that I'd refused to help my own brother in his time of need. Our parents, instead of defending me, were joining in, painting me as the ungrateful daughter who'd turned her back on family. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. I couldn't believe they'd twist things this way, couldn't understand how they could so easily dismiss everything I'd done for them, for Caleb. They'd chosen his version of events, making me the villain in a story where I'd been the only one who'd ever sacrificed anything. I withdrew even more, keeping to myself and focusing on my new responsibilities at work. My life became a series of routines, each day blending into the next as I tried to bury the pain and anger. But no matter how hard I worked, the whispers and judgment followed me. People I'd known for years now looked at me with suspicion, some even openly confronting me about my selfishness. One evening, as I was walking home, an old friend of my mother's approached me outside the grocery store. "Amelia," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment, "I never thought you'd abandon your own family like this. What happened to loyalty?" It took everything in me not to scream. Instead, I forced a tight smile and walked away, feeling the weight of their judgment pressing down on me. I was suffocating under the unfairness of it all, yet there was nothing I could do to change their minds. My family had already chosen their side. That night, alone in my small apartment, I finally let myself break. Tears spilled over, years of resentment and heartbreak flooding out as I realized just how little my sacrifices had ever mattered to them. All those moments I'd put their needs first, all those times I'd given up my own dreams for Caleb's, and this was my reward. They hadn't just betrayed me, they'd erased me, replaced me with a version of myself that suited their narrative. In that moment, I knew there was no going back. The Amelia who'd been willing to sacrifice everything for her family was gone. Whatever lay ahead, it would be on my terms, in a life built by my own choices, free from their expectations and manipulation. The next morning, with swollen eyes and a heavy heart, I made a decision. I would leave this town, cut ties with the people who only saw what they wanted to see. I didn't know where I'd go, but I knew that staying would mean living under the weight of their betrayal forever. For once in my life, I was putting myself first. With a new resolve, I began to plan my escape. I would start over somewhere fresh, where my past couldn't follow me, where I could finally become the person I'd always dreamed of being without the shadow of my family holding me back. The journey wouldn't be easy, but I knew that, for the first time, I was truly free, and that freedom was worth every sacrifice I'd ever made. Starting over was harder than I'd imagined, but it was also freeing in a way that felt almost foreign. I found a modest apartment in a new city, far enough away that I didn't run into anyone from my old life. It was small and barely furnished, but it was mine, paid for by my own hard work, with no one else's strings attached. Every day felt like a quiet victory, and slowly, I began to settle into a life without the weight of my family's demands. Work became my anchor. My new position as assistant manager kept me busy, and I poured everything into it, spending late nights at the office, learning the ins and outs of the business. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay wasn't exactly stellar, but the respect I earned from my coworkers was genuine. I could feel myself growing stronger, more self-assured. For the first time, I was building a life that had nothing to do with my family's expectations or Caleb's messes. I started making new friends too, people who saw me for who I was, not for the roles my family had shoved me into. There was Lily, a kind-hearted coworker with a quick wit and a knack for reading people, and Jasper, our head chef, who quickly became like an older brother, always ready with advice or a joke to lighten my mood. Together, they made me feel like I had a real support system, something I hadn't had in a long time. Slowly, I began to feel whole again, like I'd finally shed the shadow of the girl who'd always put everyone else first. But even as I built this new life, the hurt from my family's betrayal lingered, a dull ache that never fully went away. Every so often, I'd catch myself wondering if they missed me, if they even regretted what they'd done. The silence from them was deafening. There were no calls, no messages, nothing to acknowledge the way they'd treated me. I knew it was foolish to hold onto any hope, but a small part of me longed for an apology, some sign that they'd realized what they'd lost. One evening, after another long day, I was closing up the restaurant with Lily when my phone buzzed. I glanced down and froze. It was a text from Caleb. My heart raced as I opened it, bracing myself for whatever guilt-laden plea he was about to send. Hey, I know it's been a while, but I thought you should know that the restaurant is gone. Closed down last month. Things got worse, and Mom and Dad ended up selling the house to cover the debt. They're staying with Aunt Marcy now, but it's not great. Thought you might want to know. I read the message twice, a strange mixture of relief and anger swirling in my chest. So, they'd lost it all. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for them, but the larger part of me couldn't shake the satisfaction that this time, the consequences had fallen on them, not me. For once, they were facing the fallout of their choices without dragging me down with them. I didn't respond to Caleb. I couldn't. There was nothing I wanted to say, no sympathy I could offer. Instead, I let myself feel the vindication, the quiet justice that, for once, they were the ones bearing the weight of Caleb's failure. I felt lighter, like I was finally letting go of the last fragments of guilt they'd burdened me with. But I wasn't naive. I knew my family too well to think this was the end of it. A few days later, my phone rang. This time, it was my mother. I stared at the screen, her name glaring up at me, an unwelcome reminder of everything I'd left behind. Against my better judgment, I answered. Hello. My voice sounded strange, even to me, tight with the tension of old wounds. Amelia, sweetheart. My mother's voice came through, shaky and almost unfamiliar. It's been so long. I I just wanted to hear your voice. I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue, knowing there had to be more. My mother rarely called just to hear my voice. After a beat, she sighed, a sound that almost sounded genuine. Look, I know things have been rough between us, but he's struggling, Amelia. We all are. Losing the house has been a nightmare, and things are so difficult now. We could really use a little help, just to get back on our feet. There it was, the plea, wrapped in the same layers of guilt they'd always used to reel me back in. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar anger rise up. But this time, I was ready. I'm sorry to hear that, Mom, I said, my voice steady. But I can't help you. I've already given you everything I had. Her voice sharpened, disappointment lacing her tone. Amelia, I can't believe you turn your back on us like this. Family is supposed to support each other. After everything we've done for you. I almost laughed at the irony. Everything they'd done for me. The words felt hollow, laughable even, after everything I'd sacrificed. Maybe you should ask Caleb, I replied coldly. He's the one who got you into this mess. Don't be like that, she snapped, her patience wearing thin. You know Caleb didn't mean for any of this to happen. He just needs a little help to get back on his feet. We all do. It's not too much to ask, is it? It was like nothing had changed. She still saw Caleb as the one worth saving, the one deserving of unconditional support, while I was nothing more than a resource to be tapped when he failed. I felt a rush of anger, sharper and colder than before. I'm done, Mom, I said firmly. I can't keep sacrificing my life for Caleb's mistakes. I'm not responsible for him or for you. Her silence was heavy, filled with the weight of a reality she'd never accepted. I waited, letting the truth settle between us, hoping she'd finally see the line I was drawing. Well, she said finally, her voice brittle, I hope you're proud of yourself. Turning your back on your family. Maybe we were wrong about you after all. The words stung, but I didn't flinch. I knew they were meant to hurt, to manipulate, to bring me back into the fold. But this time they fell flat. Goodbye, Mom, I said, my voice steady as I ended the call. I let out a long, shuddering breath, the finality of the conversation settling over me like a heavy weight. For the next few days, I threw myself into work, burying the hurt and frustration in the busyness of the restaurant. Lily and Jasper noticed my change in mood, but they didn't press, offering quiet support with knowing glances and occasional words of encouragement. They didn't pry, didn't demand explanations, and I found comfort in their quiet presence. But even as I tried to move on, my family's words lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. I kept replaying my mother's parting words, the way she'd twisted my actions to make me the villain. A small part of me still felt the pull, the old instinct to return and make things right, to somehow repair the damage. Then, one evening after closing, Jasper and I sat at the bar, nursing drinks as we unwound from the day. He must have noticed the tension in my posture, the way my thoughts drifted, because he finally broke the silence. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," he said, his voice gentle. I managed a weak smile. Maybe just a small country. He chuckled, but didn't press, waiting patiently. Something about his quiet understanding made me feel safe enough to open up. "It's my family," I admitted. They don't see me. They just see someone who can fix their problems. And every time I say no, they make me feel like I'm the one who's wrong, like I'm selfish for wanting something for myself. Jasper nodded, his expression thoughtful. Families can be complicated. Sometimes they trap you in roles you never chose. But that doesn't mean you owe them your life. I looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. I'd spent so long believing that my worth was tied to what I could give, what I could sacrifice for others. But maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't owe them everything. As I walked home that night, a sense of clarity began to settle over me. I couldn't control how my family saw me, couldn't force them to understand or change. But I could choose my own path, build a life that wasn't defined by their needs or expectations. I would keep moving forward, one step at a time, letting go of the weight of their demands. Whatever they thought of me, however they judged my choices, it no longer mattered. For the first time, I was living for myself, and that was enough. As I unlocked the door to my apartment, I felt a strange peace settle over me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I was finally free, free to become whoever I wanted to be, unbound by the shadows of my past. In the months that followed, I felt like I was finally hitting my stride. My job grew more fulfilling each day as I became indispensable to the team. My coworkers came to me with questions, and my manager trusted me with more responsibilities. I took pride in everything I accomplished, knowing I'd earned it on my own. The apartment, small as it was, felt more like home each evening I came back to it. I had decorated it with things that were completely mine, no reminders of my family, no lingering signs of the past. It was like I was crafting a whole new life, layer by layer. The only real reminder of my family came in the form of occasional texts or calls from distant relatives who'd heard the family gossip. They'd reach out, guilt-laden messages about how family is all we have, or don't let pride get in the way of reconciliation. I learned quickly not to respond. Nothing I said would ever be enough to change their view. To them, I'd always be the wayward one who'd abandoned family values. One Saturday evening, I was about to head out for a rare night with Lily and some friends. Just as I was locking my door, my phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. I was about to ignore it when something made me pause. Against my better judgment, I picked up. "Hello." There was a long silence before a familiar voice came through, tentative and weak. "Amelia, it's Dad." My grip on the phone tightened, and I felt an old wound throbbing, like a bruise I'd tried to forget about. "Dad." I managed, my voice cautious, bracing for whatever guilt-laden plea was about to follow. He hesitated. "It's about Caleb." I almost hung up right there. I'd heard that line too many times before. The words came out like a reflex. "I'm not giving him money, Dad. I don't care what he's done this time." "It's not about that," he said quietly, his tone catching me off guard. "He's not doing well. He's been in and out of the hospital. His health, Amelia, it's not good." The words hung in the air, heavier than I'd expected. I felt a mix of disbelief and confusion. Caleb, the unstoppable, invincible one, was actually struggling. Part of me braced for some kind of trick or manipulation, but something in Dad's voice told me it was real this time. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. "Because he's asking for you," Dad said, his voice breaking a little. "He's been saying he wishes things were different, that he wishes you'd come back." For a moment, I felt the old instincts stirring, the desire to rush back and fix things, to fill the gaps and take care of everything. But I closed my eyes, grounding myself. I'd left for a reason, and I couldn't just erase the months of progress, the hard won independence I'd built. Dad, I said slowly, you know why I left. Caleb, you all made it clear that my role was to sacrifice, to keep giving. I can't go back to that. He didn't respond for a long time, and for a moment, I thought he might hang up. Then finally, he sighed. I understand that. I do. But things are different now. Caleb's not the same. And your mother and I, we know we made mistakes. We should have listened to you. I can see that now. The words were so unexpected, so strange to hear from my father, that I almost didn't believe him. I'd wanted this acknowledgement for years, some form of understanding, but now that it was here, I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't feel the relief or vindication I'd imagined. Instead, there was only a numbness, a hollow ache that wouldn't leave. Please, Amelia, he continued, his voice almost pleading. Just think about it. Caleb's asking for you. Just think about it. I didn't give him an answer. I just murmured something vague and hung up, feeling a mixture of emotions I couldn't untangle. That night, even as I tried to enjoy my time out with friends, his words kept echoing in my mind. I'd come so far, built so much distance, but now they were calling me back into their lives, claiming they'd changed, that things were different. I didn't know if I believed them. Part of me wanted to, but another part warned me to keep my distance, to remember everything I'd gone through to finally escape. Days passed, and I managed to distract myself with work and routine, but the call lingered in the back of my mind. I didn't reach out, didn't ask for updates, but a strange curiosity gnawed at me. I'd spent so long thinking I'd moved on, but now I was wondering if I truly had. Then, one evening, as I was preparing dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from Caleb. I stared at it, feeling a pang of something I couldn't name. Amelia, I know I don't deserve it, but can we talk? Just once. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know if I wanted to open that door again. But something in his words felt different this time. There was no arrogance, no expectation, just a quiet request. Against my better judgment, I texted back, agreeing to meet him at a coffee shop near my place. When I arrived, I barely recognized him. Caleb looked pale, thinner than I remembered, and his usual confident air was nowhere to be seen. He seemed almost nervous as I approached, shifting in his seat. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence heavy with all the things left unsaid. Finally, he looked up, meeting my gaze. Thank you for coming, he said quietly. I didn't think you would. I just nodded, unsure what to say. What did you want to talk about? He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he folded them on the table. I know I've messed up. I know I hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just, I wanted to say that I'm sorry. The words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, imagined him begging for forgiveness, but now that it was here, I felt strangely empty. I don't know if I can forgive you, Caleb, I said finally. You took so much from me. I don't know if you really understand that. He nodded, his expression pained. I know. I was selfish, and I let mom and dad make you the scapegoat, the one who always had to fix things. I didn't see it then, but I do now. And I know that's not enough. I know I can't make up for it. I want you to know that I see it now. For the first time, I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the regret that lingered there. He looked smaller, like he'd finally shed the arrogance that had always shielded him. And as much as I wanted to cling to my anger, to hold on to the hurt, I felt a small flicker of empathy. What do you want from me, Caleb? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked down, his hands trembling. Nothing, he said softly. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that if you never want to see me again, I'll understand. I just needed you to hear it. That's all. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to let go of the weight I'd carried for so long. But another part warned me to stay guarded, to remember the scars he'd left. We sat in silence, both of us struggling to bridge the gap between us, a gap filled with years of resentment, betrayal, and broken trust. Finally, I looked at him, feeling a strange sense of peace. I don't know what the future holds, Caleb, but I need time. I need space to figure out what all this means. He nodded, his expression filled with a quiet acceptance. I understand. And thank you for just hearing me out. As I left the coffee shop, a strange feeling washed over me. I wasn't sure if I could ever truly forgive Caleb or my parents, but for the first time, I felt like I'd taken a step toward healing. It wasn't closure, but it was something, maybe a start. When I got back to my apartment that night, I sat in silence, letting the emotions settle. I didn't know if I'd ever fully forgive them, but I knew one thing. My life was my own now, and I wouldn't let them take that from me again. After my meeting with Caleb, a strange calm settled over me. I didn't forgive him, not fully, but hearing him acknowledge the pain he'd caused left me with a sense of relief I hadn't expected. I'd carried around the weight of his betrayal and my family's complicity in it for so long that part of me had begun to think it would never lift. But now, with the faintest trace of acknowledgement from Caleb, I felt like I was finally able to breathe, as if I'd been holding my breath for years without realizing it. The days drifted back into routine, and I focused on the life I'd built. Work became my solace again. With every decision I made, every late night I poured into my job, I felt more and more like the person I'd always wanted to be. I wasn't Amelia, the reliable daughter, the family doormat. I was just Amelia, a woman with a future shaped by her own choices. The friendships I'd formed, especially with Lily and Jasper, deepened into something that felt more like family. They were the ones who checked in on me, who understood the pieces of my story without judgment or expectation. Then one night, I got another call from my father. I stared at my phone, wondering why I even kept his number saved. Against every instinct, I answered, curious and wary, bracing myself for whatever plea or guilt trip would come next. Amelia, he started, his voice hoarse. I know you probably don't want to hear from us, but your mother and I are struggling. We've had to pick up part-time work just to get by. Losing the house, it was harder than we expected. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch, waiting for the inevitable ask. We know things have been terrible between us, he continued, a quiver in his voice, but we miss you, sweetheart. We miss having you in our lives. Your mother, she's been having a hard time. The words made me clench my jaw. My mother. She was the one who turned on me so sharply, painting me as ungrateful to the family. She'd sided with Caleb every step of the way, dismissing my sacrifices as if they were insignificant. Part of me had waited to hear that she regretted it, but now I wasn't sure I'd even believe it. What do you want from me, Dad? I asked, my tone sharper than I'd planned. After everything that's happened, what are you expecting me to do? He hesitated, and I could hear the faint, defeated sigh on the other end. We're asking for a second chance, Amelia. We're not asking for money, just a chance to make things right. I wanted to laugh, to tell him that the chance had come and gone years ago. But there was a strange tone in his voice, a vulnerability I hadn't heard before. I thought of Caleb, how broken he'd looked when we'd last met. Maybe they were finally feeling the effects of their choices, facing the same kind of isolation I'd endured for so long. And even though part of me wanted to see them suffer, another part, smaller but insistent, felt the old instinct to fix things, to mend the cracks. Maybe, I said slowly, but things would have to change. And I don't mean temporary. I mean for good. He didn't argue, didn't offer excuses. I understand. Just please think about it. I hung up, my mind swirling with a storm of emotions. Part of me was angry with myself for even considering the possibility of letting them back in, but another part wondered if this was what healing looked like, a gradual loosening of the knots that had bound me to my anger. Over the next few days, I thought about what he'd said, but I held back from reaching out. I wasn't sure if I was ready, and the life I'd built felt too fragile to risk shattering by reopening old wounds. I needed more time, and thankfully, work was there to ground me. One evening, Lily invited me over for dinner. She'd been pestering me for weeks to see her new place, and I figured a distraction was exactly what I needed. Her apartment was cozy and filled with little touches of her personality, quirky artwork, a massive collection of plants, and a bookshelf filled with everything from poetry to cookbooks. We spent the evening cooking and laughing, sharing stories of work and life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a genuine warmth, a kind of uncomplicated joy that had been missing for years. She was like the sister I'd always wanted, the kind of friend who understood without words, who accepted me without strings. As the night wound down, Lily poured us both a glass of wine and leaned back on her couch, giving me a long, thoughtful look. So, she said, how are you feeling about everything? I knew what she meant. She'd been there, quietly listening as I navigated the storm my family had stirred up again. She didn't pry, didn't push, just waited, her presence steady and comforting. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to cut them off completely, to move on and leave them in the past. But another part wonders if maybe this is a chance to actually heal, to let them back in if they're willing to change. Lily nodded, her expression understanding. You don't have to decide right away, you know. Take your time. Healing isn't a straight line. Sometimes it means taking steps back before moving forward. Her words stuck with me as I walked home that night, the quiet city streets wrapping around me like a blanket. Maybe she was right. Maybe I didn't need to rush to any decisions, didn't need to define my relationship with my family in absolutes. I'd spent so long building walls around myself, trying to protect what little was left, but maybe healing meant finding a way to let the world back in, carefully, cautiously. The next day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Caleb. I sat down, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the envelope, bracing myself for whatever words he'd written. Inside was a short note, handwritten, the letters slightly uneven. Amelia, I don't know if I'll ever deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better. Losing everything, it made me realize what I'd had, what I'd taken for granted. I don't expect anything from you, but if you ever want to talk, I'll be here. I miss you. It was simple, raw, and yet it struck something deep within me. Maybe he really had changed. Maybe losing everything had forced him to see the world through a different lens. I didn't know if it was enough, but it was something, a gesture, however small, toward accountability. A week later, after careful thought and countless conversations with Lily, I decided to take a tentative step toward reconciliation. I texted my parents, suggesting a meeting, a chance to talk openly with no expectations and no demands. They agreed, sounding eager, even relieved, as if they'd been holding their breath, waiting for this moment. When the day arrived, I was nervous. I hadn't seen them in nearly a year, hadn't felt the pull of their presence in so long that I wondered if I'd even recognize the people they'd become. But as I walked into the cafe where we'd agreed to meet, I saw them sitting at a corner table, looking older, a little wearier, as if the weight of their choices had finally settled on their shoulders. We talked for hours, the conversation raw and unfiltered. They admitted to their mistakes, acknowledged the way they dismissed my sacrifices, the way they'd favored Caleb, the pain they'd caused. My mother cried, her hand trembling as she reached out, and my father apologized, his voice cracking as he promised to do better, to truly see me for the first time. I didn't forgive them fully, not then, but I felt a small flicker of hope, a fragile bridge stretching between us. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't erase the years of hurt, but it was a start, a chance to rebuild something new. As I left that day, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and peace. I knew that I still had a long way to go, still had pieces of myself to reclaim, but for the first time, I felt like I was moving forward, free from the weight of old wounds. I didn't know what the future held for me and my family, but I knew one thing. I was no longer defined by their expectations. I was free, truly free, to live my life on my own terms. And that, more than anything, was the beginning of something beautiful. Months passed after that tentative meeting with my parents, and I felt like I was living in two worlds, balancing my new life with this slowly healing, fragile connection to my family. I kept a distance, guarded but open enough to see if they would truly change. Surprisingly, they respected that distance. No more guilt-laden calls, no surprise visits or demands. Just a quiet, cautious reaching out, an occasional text from dad, a card from my mother for my birthday, each one careful and almost apologetic. With each small exchange, I felt the walls I'd built around myself loosen, bit by bit. It was as if I'd spent so long in a state of defensiveness that I didn't quite know how to relax. My heart would always leap when I saw a message from them, but gradually my panic gave way to curiosity and, finally, a little bit of ease. I realized I could choose how much or how little I wanted to engage. I was in control of my boundaries, and for the first time, I felt secure enough to decide how those boundaries would work for me. Then, one evening, Caleb reached out to me again, but this time it wasn't a message or a letter. He came to the city, asking if we could meet up. My first instinct was to turn him down, to keep our relationship confined to words on a page, but something about his request felt different. I agreed, deciding on a little cafe a few blocks from my apartment. The decision made me feel tense, uneasy, but I wanted to see him. I wanted to look him in the eyes and see if he had truly changed, or if this was all just an elaborate act to pull me back into the fold. I arrived first and waited at a small table near the window, watching the evening light cast soft shadows across the street. When Caleb walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked thinner, his posture a little more reserved, like he'd shrunk somehow. There was no trace of the cocky grin, no casual confidence that had once defined him. He looked vulnerable, almost fragile. He approached the table slowly, giving me a tentative smile as he sat down. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. I nodded, unsure of what to say. There was an awkward silence as we both looked around, neither of us quite knowing how to begin. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "Amelia, I don't even know where to start. I know I've hurt you so much. I just wanted a chance to talk, to tell you that I've been trying to make things right, even if I don't know if I can." I watched him, noticing the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. This wasn't the Caleb I'd grown up with, the golden child who could do no wrong. He looked like a man who had been stripped of all his illusions, someone who had been forced to confront himself in ways he never had before. "I appreciate that," I said quietly. "But words aren't enough, Caleb. I need to see actions. You can't just expect things to go back to the way they were." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. I don't expect that. I just, I want you to know that I'm trying to be better. I've been going to therapy, working on myself, and for the first time, I think I'm starting to understand what I put you through, what I put everyone through." His honesty surprised me, and I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected: hope. Not for a complete repair of our relationship, but for something new, something healthier. I didn't trust him fully yet, but maybe I could allow myself a bit of cautious optimism. "What about mom and dad?" I asked, not even sure if I wanted to hear the answer. Do they see things differently now?" Caleb sighed, looking down at his hands. "They're trying in their own way. They're set in their ways, and I think it's harder for them to admit that they made mistakes. But they've been going to family therapy too. It's slow, but they're trying." I wasn't sure if I believed him, but something about his words rang true. I could feel the sincerity in his voice, the quiet desperation to repair what he'd broken. I didn't know if things would ever be fully healed between us, but in that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. "Caleb," I said softly, "I'm not saying I can forget everything. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive what happened. But maybe we can start over, in a way. Not as the people we used to be, but as something new." His eyes filled with gratitude, and for the first time, I saw the brother I remembered from when we were young, the one who used to look out for me before life pulled us apart. "I'd like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. We sat in silence for a while, watching the people passing by outside. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace around Caleb, a quiet acceptance that we were both different people now. We weren't the same siblings we'd been growing up, and maybe that was a good thing. Maybe it was exactly what we needed. As the weeks passed, we stayed in touch, exchanging texts and meeting occasionally for coffee. I kept my boundaries firm, making sure not to fall into old patterns, but I allowed myself to open up to him, little by little. He became part of my life in a way that felt healthy, balanced. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments when I felt the old resentment bubble up, but I managed to keep it in check, reminding myself of the progress we'd both made. My parents reached out too, cautiously at first. They invited me over for dinner, and although I hesitated, I eventually agreed. It was strange being back in their home, seeing the familiar rooms that held so many memories, both good and painful. My mother was softer, more tentative, and my father seemed quieter, as if he too had been humbled by everything that had happened. The dinner was pleasant, almost awkward, with none of the old expectations hanging over us. We talked about simple things: the weather, my job, their new hobbies. For once, it felt like they were seeing me as my own person, not just as the daughter they could rely on to fix everything. Afterward, as I was leaving, my mother hugged me tightly, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for giving us a chance, Amelia. I know we don't deserve it, but thank you." I did respond, just held her for a moment, feeling the bittersweet mix of love and pain that would always linger between us. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a step, a small bridge we could both choose to walk if we wanted to. And for now, that was enough. Back in my apartment that night, I thought about everything I'd been through, all the sacrifices, the hurt, the anger that had defined so much of my life. I realized that I wasn't the same person anymore. I had grown, had found strength in my independence, and I knew that no matter what happened with my family, I would never lose myself again. The next day at work, I felt lighter, freer. Jasper and Lily noticed the change in me, teasing me about my mysterious glow. I laughed, brushing it off, but I knew they were right. I had found a peace that I hadn't thought possible, a balance between my past and my future. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up, and for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. In the months that followed, my family and I slowly built a new relationship, one that was defined by respect and boundaries. We weren't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but I knew I could handle it. I had learned to stand on my own, to protect myself without closing off completely. It was a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life. As I looked around at the life I'd created, the friendships I'd built, and the independence I'd fought so hard to earn, I felt a sense of pride that was mine alone. My family was a part of me, but they no longer defined me. I was finally free, free to be the person I wanted to be, to live a life that was mine and mine alone. And as I walked down the bustling streets of the city I'd come to love, I felt a quiet certainty settle within me. I had chosen my own path, had learned to find strength within myself, and no matter what the future held, I knew I would be okay. I was my own person, whole and complete, and for the first time in my life, I was truly unapologetically free.